Hello again, folks. Jeffery Donaldson here with another Jeweler's Eye reading of a single poem from a new book of poems by a Canadian poet. Now, something a little different this time around. The poem that I have my eye on is from the second volume of a 3-volume collection by Wayne Clifford entitled The Exile's Papers, published by Porcupine's Quill. The third volume was published just 2 years ago in 2011. Now, the volumes contain a series of sonnets. The books are all sonnets that make a kind of broken, continuous narrative that is all of autobiography, love story, metaphysics, and reflections on the art of poetry itself. Which brings me to a poem that attracted my attention, a poem about the relationship between writers and readers, makers of poems and readers of poems, a piece called The Other from Volume 2 of The Exile's Papers. The Other. Allow the page is wall, and one of us is on a side well known. Allow the sounds spoken out of the page, the verbs and nouns made palate, tongue, and throat are carnate thus. Allow you understand the here of this, the whole of that. Not to know is grounds for wondering forever what surrounds the circumstantial immanence of is. Pretend a moment death's a page where life's not provable on one side. Allow it's mine. That way you needn't feel alone until the sides are certain. We both know strife's assizable for what it proves, and sign is all a word can hope it might fulfill. So yes, a little think piece on the relationship between the poet-maker and the poet's imagined audience, the reader, where we get the sense of an intimate, direct address with who the speaking voice is imagining, is looking down at the words of the page that the poem is. But the poem opens up from there into the concerns of personal identity and selfhood and ownhood, both the poets and the poems. But any poem called The Other, we could imagine, will be invoking such a question of one's own identity and being and the relationship of that identity to what others in their reflection of us make real. That concern is very neatly woven into the problems of poem and reader, with the poem on the page and the living reader looking down on it as one of the resonances there. It's a kind of question that I suppose is implied in all poems. Does the text hide a self? Does the text hide a creator, one who is in the present of the poem? The poet is someone who made the poem in a living moment in the past, but the remnants of that living act are these words on the page. To what extent can we imagine that these unliving marks on the page disguise something that is still alive within it, a latency that is waiting to be livingly fulfilled again in the mind of a subsequent reader? There is a latency in a written text that remains merely potential until it is picked up by a reader. But that sense of potential is closely related both in poetry in general and in this poem to the notion of imaginative hypothesis, a pretending, a dwelling in the uncertainties of the imaginary, thinking of Keats's term negative capability, where in literature we cultivate the idea of dwelling in fictional uncertainties without any hankering after fact. And the poem here makes a fairly direct appeal to the work of hypothesis. So that sense of a desired fulfillment is embodied in the quote-unquote address of the poem, this intimate address of the speaking voice to the imagined reader of that voice. These gesturings towards the you who is presently experiencing the poem in a living moment. And that's what's at stake, of course, right? That one needn't feel alone both that the solitary, unliving, speaking voice of these marks on the page needn't feel alone, but also that the reader may feel a connection with something that is latently alive and waiting to be fulfilled in his or her mind, that there isn't isolation, that the other is not an other, but one of us, as he says there in the first line. Allow the page's wall. Of course, one of the ways in which a poem can go about disguising latent voices, you won't be surprised to hear me argue, is to echo or allude to other voices that we then recognize are latent within it. And Clifford is disguising in just this way in the first line, allow the page's wall. I had to laugh. I thought right away of that marvelous, theatrically self-reflexive scene in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, where a band of conspicuously uncourtly players tries to throw together a little drama in which they require a wall. They're going to put on this play about Pyramus and Thisbe, and yet they lack a wall, so someone is going to have to perform the wall. And Shakespeare being wonderfully self-reflexive about the imaginative allowances that one makes in theater, where one can be a thing simply by calling oneself that. And so Wall speaks in the play that is finally performed in Act 5. I love how Shakespeare is playing with this idea of the self-fulfilling declarations of fictive language. We make a thing so by saying it. The truth is so. And we'll see as Clifford's poem unfolds how the kinds of imaginative allowances we make for the pretendings of poetry have altogether to do with what is true, what is provable, as he says towards the end, what is fulfillable finally. So yes, Clifford takes this idea of the wall in A Midsummer Night's Dream and applies it to the reality of our experience of poems. And it's a wonderful idea, isn't it, that the printed poem on the page represents a kind of wall, that it comes between two different realities, one a creative act now in the past, and one a present act unfolding in the reader's mind, and that these two minds, if you will, are separated by this thing that comes between them that the reader is staring at, and it makes a barrier. And Clifford plays with a confusion of who is on what side of the wall. Allow the page's wall, and one of us is on a side well known. Well, what side is that? Certainly the poet creating the poem at the time of writing would be imagining that his side is very well known. He's sitting there writing his poem, and that the unknown side is the reader, who he imagines at a later point staring down at the words that he puts on the page when he is no longer there. But of course, to the reader, it is the moment of original creation that is unknown, and the actual living world in which the reader reads that is the side well known. And so the poem will be playing throughout on this relationship between what's alive and what's dead or what's past. In the ambiguity that Clifford invokes in the first lines, we're not going to be allowed to conclude too easily that there is a deadness about the page and a livingness about the reader's own moment of experience. This is what we do in poems. This idea that the poem on the page harbors or disguises a livingness that we're not always attentive to or aware of, that something thrives within it that is waiting to be recognized by a reader who comes to the poem to be awakened into those vitalities. The poem is made up of a set of imperatives. These sentences: allow the page, allow the sounds, allow you understand, pretend a moment, allow it's mine. These phrases are all in the imperative, but it's even more nuanced than just the simple imperative. There's a mode that doesn't really exist in English in its original grammatical form called the jussive, which is the issue of a command, but often in the form of wish fulfillment. One of the finest examples of it comes from the original creative act at the beginning of Genesis in the Bible. God's speaking, "Let there be light." He's both imagining the possibility of light and commanding that there should be such a thing as light. And I've always thought it's a wonderful gesture for the Bible to be making there at the very beginning of its great creative myth. A God speaking an entire cosmology into being by asking for an allowance to be made along the same lines that Clifford is doing here. So this poem is, in its own way, representing a kind of genesis of the reality that it is also simply speaking of. It both speaks of that reality and makes that reality actual. So the poem unfolds according to this series of commands, but then ends with a sentence in the indicative. We both know. There's a fine little narrative just unfolding in the syntax itself there, right? That this appeal that is made from the speaking voice to an imagined reader unfolds according to a set of recommendations or orders, pleadings even if you like, but then resolves into this statement of a shared knowledge that certainly in syntactical terms represents the poem's arrival at its best promise. And so we move on. We wouldn't be surprised to find in a poem that while it speaks of sounds, it would be trying to perform them at the same time. And we see that here. Allow the sounds spoken out of the page. The verbs and nouns made palate, tongue, and throat are carnate thus. So Clifford announces that verbs and nouns are spoken out of the page, and then in the very next line gives us a verb and some nouns that incarnate what he had just declared would be incarnate in the line before. Verbs and nouns. Made are verb, palate, tongue, and throat. Nouns. And look how texturally the poem does incarnate its own sounds, palate, tongue, and throat. All very palate-y, tonguey, and throaty words for what it is that they describe. The tongue and the throat, the palate. Curious kind of onomatopoeia going on there. A lot of the commands, the requests for allowance, are quite tongue-in-cheek in the poem. Allow you understand the here of this, the whole of that. Well, it seems pretty clear that we don't necessarily understand where the here of this and where the whole of that are. Clifford works up the same kind of ambiguity as he's given us in the first stanza, and one of us is on a side well known. Allow you understand the here of this, the whole of that. You look at the phrase like the here of this, and you're imagining that it is simply the here of the words being on the page, the lines speaking about their own presence there in front of you, where they declare that they are in a here that is not where you are. And of course, as a reader, as you look at the poem on this page, you see it in its entirety. You see the whole of it, and meditate on where the here of what it is speaking of might be. But you could easily flip it the other way. The here of this is the moment that I am staring at those words and saying the here of this. So that in turn, the whole of that, it becomes my imagining that the poem itself represents a whole to some extent that will always elude my own gestures towards it. So the elusive environment of the poem, the living reality of the reader and the reading experience, these are the sides, and they represent the heres and wholes of experience. But again, we're not easily going to be able to decide which is which. And very tongue-in-cheek, Clifford says, not to know is grounds for wondering forever what surrounds the circumstantial immanence of is. Such a beautiful line. First, we want to think of the relationship between walls and grounds, walls standing on grounds, but also this sense that the lack of knowledge Clifford is speaking of here leaves us wondering about experience in a more quite actually roundabout way. The wall creates barriers, but what not knowing who is on what side of those barriers does is leave us wondering and wandering, if you like, around that very barrier, wondering forever what surrounds the circumstantial immanence of is, the revelation of an immanence that is circumstantial. Prefix of this word circumstantial in its Latin root meaning to go around, matching very nicely with what surrounds, so that what surrounds is quite actually circumstantial. But such carefully nuanced work here, right? One of the things you can hear in the word immanence is imminent. If you were just hearing it aloud, you could scarcely distinguish the two words. For something to be imminent means that it is about to be. A sense of an imminence of is invokes a kind of promise, which is entirely appropriate to a poem that is trying to make what is otherwise imagined actual. But of course the word is immanence. Immanence. This word means for something to be indwelling, for there to be an abidance. And how perfectly does that work through the entire poem, this sense of the poem on the page as containing a circumstantial immanence, something present and living within it, which becomes merely circumstantial, which it surrounds by embodying, an immanence that for the reader is imminent, that is always about to be as the reader responds to those possibilities. But then the poem shifts gears and adds a further inference to this question of sides of reality, of what is real and unreal, letting the other shoe fall and invoking the relationship between the sides of life and death. He says, pretend a moment death's a page where life's not provable on one side. This is the paradox of the difference between life and death, which is the same paradox that comes to bear in the division between unliving marks on the page that contain a vitality within them and a living reader who responds to them. That death's a page, taking us back to the page being a wall, that the poem on the page is this unliving environment whose life cannot be proved on its own side, as it were. It requires the response of a living reader to bring it to life. And so Clifford gestures to the possibility that there was this creative act in the past that is gone now, and it is gone now as you read the poem. The speaking voice confesses at this moment that the absent one, as the reader reads, is the speaking voice of the poem itself, which, of course, as black marks on a page, does not live in the way that the reader lives. It invokes the question, is there a living presence that speaks within a text, for whom what is said and shown is a mine, is an ownhood, it's life. And, of course, behind that is the ownhood and actual life of the creating poet, who is trying to write in such a way that his own life will speak through these barriers. And by making that allowance, by allowing that there is a death present and that death is the speaking voice's mind, it is a gesture of identification towards the reader who will fulfill it, who will make it real. So that while there is this uncertainty about what lives and what doesn't live, both in the poet's creative efforts, the poem on the page, and in the reader's responding mind, while there are these uncertainties as to what lives and what doesn't in the poet's own creative mind, in the poem on the page, and in the reader's response, we nonetheless feel that the poem is resolving its way towards this sense of a shared identity, where these livingnesses hypothetically, allowingly, come together. And they come together in this moment until the sides are certain. The sides become nowhere as certain as when one crosses the barrier into death. The sides become certain even as they're erased. Not to make too metaphysical fine a point of it. But what comes out of this is the potential allowance of a shared intimacy that is making do while we wander around in these uncertain spaces of life and death. The final allowance in the poem is this possibility of a shared intimacy. The poem then resolves into an indicative declaration. So much through the poem not known, sides well known, one side not knowing well. The problem of understanding in the middle stanza, question of not knowing there, all of these mysteries resolving into this declarative statement that we both know. So a sense of the poem resolving into the comfort of a knowledge that is shared. We both know strife's sizable for what it proves, and sign is all a word can hope it might fulfill. So what is proffered in the end is not so much an arrival or a total understanding, but a striving, and what measure of our strivings we might look to discover in something like a poem. But there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek here at the end as well. Clifford says we both know, and yet at the same time he plants a little bit of doubt around what it is that we both know, and that knowledge is very nuanced and elusive right to the end. We measure the value of our strivings by what they prove, which begs the question, of course, of what has this poem proved? What has it tested? What has it proved is so? It's a question that is begged in the poem and not entirely answered. But instead of claiming itself as a proof, the poem resolves itself into a restatement of what that striving might be, and sign is all a word can hope it might fulfill. And what a dizzying wash of possibilities there are here. Given the poem we've just passed through, we're ready to read sign in a number of different senses. Sign in the strictly linguistic sense of the signifier, but also sign in the sense of harbinger or trace. That in this poem there is a sign of a living presence. There is the abidance, the suspicion, if you like, of a living presence that the word then could be hoping it might fulfill. So all through the poem we could say that there are signs of the living presence of an original creative act that was the poet writing, and the word reaches to fulfill those signs and bring that creative act alive again in the reader's mind. And yet there's another possibility there too. I'm a great fan of the word hope and the different ways in which hope and hopeful acts become embodied in the kinds of allowances and pretendings that we make in poems. And I love how Clifford gives hope effectively the last word. And you can almost hear a different grammatical sense there if you sort of squint and turn your head sideways, that it is a hope itself that is being fulfilled in the word. The word here, of course, is hoping to fulfill something else, but there is a sense that hope itself is an indigenous property, if you like, of the allowances and pretendings that the poem makes, and that hope itself is, again, fulfilled in the reader's mind. And so this beautiful gesturing of the poet towards his possible readers, whom he cannot know, and how beautiful that idea that the poem itself represents the possibility of two people who are separated, poet and reader, that the poem is that domain in which neither is entirely alone. Quite possibly the very most a poem itself can hope to fulfill. That then is Wayne Clifford's The Other, from Volume 2 of his 3-volume work, The Exile's Papers, published by Porcupine's Quill, the final volume in 2011.